Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us in this webinar titled How to Comply with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, also known as UFLPA. My name is Rakesh Srikumar, and I'm the Chief Product Officer at Copperwire. Copperwire is a blockchain platform company based out of Sunnyvale, California, and we offer solutions that help enterprises operationalize trust within their supply chains and sustainability data through better transparency, verifiability, integrity, and automation. I am pleased to be joined today with a panel of experts, George, Matthew, John Foote, and Dr. Raghavan Ramanan, it's also known as Dr. Ram. I would invite them to introduce themselves. George, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I'll go first. As the title says, I work for Avocado Green Brands as the supply chain, sustainability, and more importantly, certification VP. I ensure that everything comes certified and as clean as advertised. That's my job. I'm a third-generation farmer. I consider myself an activist for the farmers. So great to be here.
Thank you, George. John, over to you, sir.
Yeah, my name's John Foote. I'm a partner in the law firm Kelly Dry & Warren, based in Washington, D.C. I am a customs lawyer by training and an expert in U.S. forced labor trade enforcement, including the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act.
Thank you, John. Dr. Ram?
Hi, I'm Ram Ramanan. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer for Copperwire, and I am an author, having authored 2 books on sustainability, a Fulbright Fellow, and I've had about 3 decades of experience with the corporate consulting and academic world in the sustainability area.
Thank you. So let us take a look at our agenda today. We have 4 segments. We'll start with Dr. Ram helping unpack the UFLPA to the audience, for the audience. We'll have a solution demo following that, showing you how we can help importers and enterprises comply with this act, and followed by a panel discussion. And then we'll open it up for audience Q&A. So without further ado, I invite Dr. Ram to present his segment, Unpacking the UFLPA.
Greetings, friends and colleagues. Human rights violation is a travesty. As you're aware, business and community leaders like you can shape our future. Come join us. The first known effort of protecting human rights was the 6th century Cyrus cylinder. It was followed by the 13th century Magna Carta and the United Nations Declaration in the mid-20th century. With recent shift from shareholder primacy to stakeholder primacy, also called inclusive capitalism, developed nations are providing legal backbone to ethical factors. US UFLPA, EU Supply Chain Directive, UK Modern Slavery Act are some examples that ban forced labor goods. Another example is the German Supply Chain Act of June 2021 that requires due diligence of the entire global supply chains to forbid forced labor. What are the threats? Next slide, please. To our human rights. Lack of supply chain visibility, commingled materials to hide origin, and deliberate transshipment to hide the source where it comes from. And finally, the fear of China's retaliatory sanctions. UFLPA, how did we get here? In 1930, the US Tariff Act, Section 307, and the more recent 2020 US-Mexico-Canada agreement both ban forced labor goods. In 2021, UFLPA was signed into law and has been effective since June 2022. A key feature of this regulation is the presumption of guilt, and the onus of rebuttal is on the importer. Next slide, please. The information required for rebuttal are categorized in 5 groups in this rule: the due diligence system, tracing of the supply chain, the goods and the makers, management measures, and evidence for goods not from China and those goods that are originating from China. Next slide, please. The due diligence information that is required to be provided includes in place that you have the due diligence in place to assess and address forced labor risk, and one that engages with suppliers and stakeholders. So that's the first set of information you have to give. Second, the supply chain mapping and assessment of forced labor risks along the supply chain and from raw materials to imported good production, all the way. Finally, written supplier code of conduct that forbids the use of forced labor and addresses the risk of Chinese government labor schemes. Next slide, please. The supply chain tracing information requires providing evidence that pertain to overall supply chain, the merchandise or components thereof, and the minor producer or manufacturer. We will address each one of them in greater detail now. Next slide, please. The evidence pertaining to overall supply chain include description of the supply chain in detail for goods as well as processes, the description of the roles of the entities in the supply chain, and a confirmation whether or not they're also manufacturers, and relationships of supply chain entities per CFR 152.102, and a list of suppliers at each step, their names and their contact information. Finally, affidavits from each company or entity involved in the production process. Next slide, please. The evidence pertaining to goods include, and this is the list, and I'm just going to read it one time so you are paying attention there to those particular requirements. You need to provide purchase orders, invoices, packing list, bill of materials, certificates of origin, payment records, sellers and buyers inventory records, bills of lading, receipts of all suppliers and sub-suppliers, and finally, the import and export records. It's a fairly extensive set of documents that you have to have available and be able to provide for rebuttal purposes. Next one, please. Finally, when we are dealing with evidence pertaining to minor, producer, or manufacturer, you need to have the same evidence that you had in the previous list pertaining to raw materials. In addition, mining, production, or manufacturing records, adequate data for the Customs and Border Patrol to trace raw materials to the goods, production orders, reports on factory production capacity, reports on factory site visits by the importer or a third party for audit and other purposes, and evidence that the input volume matches the output volume, and any other evidence that you can use to prove that forced labor was not used. Next slide, please. Information on supply chain management measures. This requires demonstration of internal controls in place to prevent or mitigate forced labor risk and remediate any use of forced labor identified, as well as assurance that these documents that you're providing are part of an operating or an accounting system that includes audited financial statements. The next category deals with the evidence goods, and those evidence that are not from China, were not made in Zoar, and this calls for documentation tracing the supply chain for the goods. Next slide, please. Evidence that goods originating in China were not mined, produced, or manufactured wholly or in part by forced labor. And this section requires more extensive evidence. One, supply chain map identifying all the entities involved, information on workers at each entity involved in production in China, including wage payment and production output per worker, recruitment and internal controls to ensure workers in China were recruited and working in voluntarily, and finally, proof that credible audits to identify forced labor indicators and remediation are in place. They want appropriate audits to be in place. Next slide, please. Now we move on to 3 commodity-specific requirements, and this is a kind of an organic list, and it could grow depending on what is discovered in the future. The first commodity we're going to look at is tomatoes. This is the largest produced from Zoar, and this documentation requires for rebuttal supply chain traceability documents showing point of origin of seeds, tomatoes, and tomato processing facility, including the entity that sourced the tomato seeds and or tomatoes, and records for the tomato seeds, tomatoes, and or tomato products that identify every step from farm to ship, and identity of all the entities involved, citing their particular business records, so that each upstream entity with whom the importer did not transact also has to be declared and provided to the agency. The next slide, please. Some of you may be aware that China is the largest exporter of cotton, and about 80% of all the cotton of China really comes from the Zoar region. And therefore, rebuttal in this case calls for adequate documentation such as purchase orders, payment records to show the entire supply chain, production process flowchart, and maps of the region with each step numbered with supporting documents, and finally, identity of all the entities involved, once again, citing business records of each entity with whom the importer did not directly transact. Next slide, please. And as many of you may be fully aware, polysilicon is the most significant import for solar panels. And this rebuttal requires complete records of transaction and supply chain showing all entities involved and the country of origin of each material, production process flow chart, and the maps of the regions, each step numbered with supporting documents, all the way from quartzite to polysilicon to downstream goods to imported goods. Identity of all the entities involved, once again, citing their business records of each entity and where the importer did not directly transact with. And finally, importers are cautioned in the rule itself that you should be aware if you are importing goods from factories that source polysilicon from both within and outside Zoar, risk detention, just because it's very difficult to assure that the materials have not been replaced or commingled. Rakesh, back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Ram. That was a very perspicuous walkthrough of the UFLPA as it's relevant to all importers, especially in terms of the level of traceability that's required and the list of different exhaustive almost evidence that is required to be presented as a rebuttal to the risk of presumption, right? So thanks a lot for that. We will now move on to the solution demo section. And before I get into that, just to give you a bit of the context of the scenario that we're going to take you through. We will show you how we will help Bed and Beyond, a fictitious company here that supplies or sells bedding products. They have linen, they have pillow covers and throw blankets, and part of the bed linen, you have cotton that comes from China. So very important for them to be prepared in case they are, faced with the presumption at the port by the CBP. Now, what we have done is that we basically implement a supply chain track and trace solution that runs on blockchain technology to capture and trace all the information, relevant information across the supply chain, and encapsulate all that within a simple QR code, which can be then printed on any of their documents or even on the products, and then present to the customs and border protection officials who can simply scan that QR code and access all the information that they need. So we'll take you through that. Let me switch over to the application here. All right, can you all see my screen? Yeah. Okay, so I assume that you can see my screen here. So this is a demo of the mobile experience or the interface that comes up when the official scans the QR code that you present him or her with. So once you get that, you know the shipment that this is particularly relevant to, and you start by clicking on this verify button. And what you see is all the different products that are part of the shipment. You may have a single product or multiple products, but in this case, we'll take you through the cotton bed sheets. What you can see here is that we have organized the information exactly the way the Act spells it out, right? So the Act wants you to present information across all these different categories. And we have presented that so that it makes it very easy for the customs official to navigate through this information. So there's due diligence system, supply chain tracing, supply chain management measures, and goods origin. And what we found out was that there's a lot of repetition between all these different categories, but we have maintained that repetitive information so that when they go through their checklist, they are able to see that information, even though it appears in different places, but it helps them to assess that particular category of evidence that they're looking for. So let's start here with the due diligence system. You see these are the subcategories of information that is required. You can click on this, assessment of forced labor risk. You have all the different, you have the cotton company, there is the yarn producer, and the fabric manufacturer. So let's click on the cotton company, especially since cotton is one of the products that comes under greater scrutiny. So let's click here and see that the cotton company has uploaded a completed questionnaire. This is the STRT, Slavery and Trafficking Risk Questionnaire that the company Bed and Beyond has asked the supplier to complete. So once they have completed that, this shows up here. And what we have done is every piece of data, documentation is recorded as it's entered from the source on blockchain, which brings greater integrity to that entire data record. Because once the data is entered into blockchain, you cannot tamper with it. So you provide verifiability on blockchain. You can see that when you verify the data, what it really does is the application, the platform checks your current data against the original record that was entered in the blockchain, so that if there is anything, the original data was submitted by the supplier, you can make sure that that data is memorialized forever on blockchain. And what it does is it checks the current data against that original record and sees if it is the same. If it is not, then this verification status would say failed. So that is kind of the golden record of truth that's on blockchain. And there's a lot of cryptographic proofs. This is auditable, and you can generate a certificate for this for every piece of data that is recorded on the system. So going back, just taking you through the rest, you have supply chain mapping. You have the bedsheet, the yarn, and the cotton here. Click on this. You see that the cotton supply chain has all these different steps that has been tracked and traced using a supply chain traceability solution. You have all the steps here, and you can verify every single step here. Let's start on, let's look at cultivation. The data being captured there, for example, there are photographs or videos of the farm. You have maybe some test results. You also have the actual location that you can see. The border protection official can look at, whether it is, this is in the eastern part of China, and it's nowhere near the region that has, that's the Zhuar region, and so on. So all this data can be verified instantly and on blockchain. So if you look at the next one in terms of, say, supplier code of conduct, you have all these kinds of documents that are uploaded by the supplier, completed and uploaded by the supplier, and you can have that verifiable as well. Now, if there are training records that you are recording, you can have that information as well, showing all the training, the attendees, and all the information again recorded on blockchain. If I go back quickly, because a lot of this is just information that is recorded at source, providing that entire traceability and eventually the verifiability at the source of the data. You have now supply chain tracing. These are again exactly mapping to the Act and the requirements. You can again look at the cotton supply chain. You have the ability to look at the map view. Let me see here if I can. You can see, you can click on all, you can zoom in, you can click on each of the nodes in the supply chain, look at the details behind each of the entities at that location, and so on. So you provide the full geo-mapped visibility to the official. If you look at the next one, you have seen that this list in Dr. Ram's slides. All these documents are available. So if it's purchase orders, all the purchase orders that are part of the supply chain are recorded here. You can take a look at the actual copy of the purchase order, and again, verifiable on blockchain. You can see things like certificates of origin, again, uploaded from the source with verifiability. And then looking at the other set of documents, there's a whole bunch of documentation that's required. So production orders, all this is being recorded. And we will also switch over to the application, the track and trace application, which allows you to actually request this information from your suppliers and also monitor all that, all the data coming in. And this, the consequence of all the track and trace that you see do is what you see here. Now, quickly looking at supply chain measures, you can see things like independent review. If there was an audit done by an external party or a certificate issued by a certification body based on some standards, those can be presented here as well with verifiability on blockchain. So here you have the goods origin. This is one of the critical categories of evidence that is required. So this is the supply chain, right? So you have the ones that are originating in China kind of highlighted. You could click on one of these. You'll see that the list of evidence required, especially if a part or a whole of the product originates from China, is different. you'll need to have, in this case, if your the product originates from China, you have to show the list of workers, the proof of voluntary recruitment, proof of wage payment and production, and proof of free from labor indicators. So what we do is we can integrate with the suppliers' HR systems and pull in this data, provide them the ability to upload this data. So you can have the entire list of employees, you can have them upload their national identification data. You have things like voluntary recruitment, where you can share the actual worker's contract that has been signed with the employee. Especially, it would need to state that the contract is voluntary and based on the free will of the contractor. And then you have things like wage payment. Again, we can bring this data in by integrating or taking feeds in from their HR system. So it could be pay slips and so on and so forth. So with this, I'll just switch over quickly. I'm wary of time here. We will look at this is our core sustainability tracing and reporting application, which allows you to track and trace all your ESG data across multiple topics. Well, we have a compliance module where we will show you how you can comply with the UFLPA, how you collect the data, right? So you have all these shipments here, you have the due diligence information being captured, supply chain mapping, supplier compliance, and product compliance. And if you look at the shipments here, this particular shipment, you are basically tracking and tracing the order details. You have a single pane. This is what we do for most of our customers in terms of supply chain track and trace. You have a single pane that gives you the complete view of the end-to-end physical, informational, and financial flows that happen across your supply chain, and data is being captured at each step and verifiable on blockchain. Now, you have invoices, various documents, and in the due diligence section, you can see that for every particular supplier, you have the ability to capture. So here we captured due diligence with the help of a questionnaire, which is the STRD questionnaire. These are the 3 different suppliers, and you can look at the completed STRD questionnaire. Now, that's a due diligence part. In supply chain mapping, you can look at all your products and look at the structural mapping of your supply chain. You can have multiple tiers of visibility here, and you can have the geo mapping as well. So this is how you would, in your transactional application, you're able to track and trace the flows in real time for every single order, every single shipment. Now, going into supplier compliance, you're capturing, again, a lot of this information, the transactional operational information about the various orders, the products, the various contracts, the invoices, the transactions, any kind of exceptions, and the various compliance docs. Now, in terms of product compliance, you can have a very detailed view of the demand, the supply, and in this case, you have the multi-tier view of the product's supply chain, from the cotton farm, the yarn unit, fabric, and the warehouses in India and in Orange County, where this company is located. You can also see any kind of exceptions. Now, in the farm, which is 2 tiers upstream, you see that there is an exception here, and you can monitor if certain certificates have been updated and so on. So in this case, the certification status has expired, and you can notify them to update that. So that is one. And then we'll quickly switch over and show you how a partner or a supplier would see this data. So they would log in and they would see all these different data requests from from their customer, in this case, Bed and Beyond, or the customer right upstream. and you'll see that there are you're required to enter the data. You can come in, and here there is a form for you to upload the supplier's code of conduct, or in this case, you can upload the STRD questionnaire. There are different ways to capture this data, including, by providing forms or through direct APIs or through even IoT sensors and so on and so forth. So with this, I'll stop this segment and let us switch over to the next segment in the agenda today, which is really the panel discussion. So let me actually stop sharing and switch over to video mode. We have our panelists here. Let me quickly bring up the questions. So let us start. And just before we get into the panel segment, would suggest to everybody in the audience to ask us questions in the Q&A part of the Zoom panel there, and we will take it on right after the panel discussions and try to answer those. Thank you. So first question to George. George, could you tell us a little more about your role at Avocado? And secondly, could you please explain what are the implications of this act for Avocado?
Well, see, in the context of our topic that's being discussed, my background, is extremely critical because we are all about traceability and certifications and organic and regenerative, and this is what Avocado is all about. So in my role, I do have extensive background in farming. So I need to ensure that the farmers are treated right, they are paid correctly, their farming habits are safe. So these are all some of the things that motivated me to get into this field. And Avocado as a company, they're very passionate about these things. So now looking at the challenge that we are facing with Uyghur and the topic in discussion here. So we were compelled to address UFLPA and all challenges that various countries offer. Avocado directly do not do any business with China, but we have to be aware of it and we need to be proactive. Most of our cotton comes from India, Bangladesh, Peru, Portugal, and Turkey. But we need to be equally aware of it, and we need to take precaution and make sure we are doing things in such a way that we are following all the international laws. So with that said, Avocado is a sustainable, conscious company. We wanted to proactively ensure that there is no forced labor risk in our supply chain. And we also wanted to be prepared to address the risk of CBP force stopping our containers. Anytime a container is stopped, there is a severe loss of revenue. It gets stopped. We don't have materials on time. All the associated fees, delays in production, lost revenue. It's a big deal when a container is stopped. So we had to act, and we want to avoid this risk completely. So, at a personal level, being responsible for the supply chain and sustainability functions at Avocado. So I have the responsibility of complying with this act and I have to ensure we avoid any kind of supply chain disruption, ensure complete regulatory compliance, and most importantly, this is about supporting the core tenets of our sustainability policy and topic that are so dear to me personally and to the company. Rakesh?
Yeah, thank you, George. Just one more question to you. You are a CopperWire customer, and I would love to have you talk about how the CopperWire solution has helped you, both in traceability of your supply chains and how it has helped you be prepared proactively, really, to address this UFLPA compliance topic?
See, we were looking for a complete solution to help us improve our supply chain visibility and provenance traceability across our entire product line, which includes wool, latex, cotton. So, we were looking for a solution where we don't really have to go all over the place and do patchwork. We needed a complete solution. So we wanted to communicate our products' authenticity, origin, sustainability practices to our customers directly, directly to our customer. That is the key. In a very transparent manner to differentiate our products, and we need to have our customer trust. So we chose copper wire to help us with this challenge, as we did a very extensive search. I myself did it, our IT department. We looked around, and we found that copper wire had a nearly perfect fit, and we couldn't find anything better in the market. And we were studying the UFLPA mandate, very closely, and we realized that the requirements were already being mostly met by our supply chain traceability solution, which we've been working with copper wire for a while. So it was an easy transition, and it was easy for us to implement as a result with copper wire. So we were looking for both supply chain traceability and trust in data from our suppliers. Copper wire solution with full traceability and proof that can help rebut anything that CBF could come up with, their presumptions. We know that we are equipped to deal with it if it were to ever come up. So we do have a QR code, which we can, give to CBP at the port, and they can scan and access all the evidence they need to assess that our products are free of any forced labor in any part of our supply chain. So we are very confident, and copper wire actually has been extremely supportive, and especially with the RAM coming in, they've offered us a complete solution, education, and we feel very confident that we are equipped to handle anything that might come up.
Thank you, George. And over to John. John, the first question for you is that you must have heard the US has recently blocked more than 1,000 shipments of solar panels or concerns around the Uyghur forced labor being involved in those shipments, right? So in such situations, besides the financial and operational implications of being stopped or disrupted, what are some of the legal implications of such a situation?
Yeah, I think that one of the most important takeaways from that particular development with 1,000 solar panel shipments having been detained is the extent to which Customs is focusing its enforcement around the priority commodities that have been identified in the UFLPA. And Ram covered this well in his presentation. Currently, the focus is on tomatoes, cotton, and polysilicon, because those are all three different commodities that have been identified as being produced in substantial quantities in the XUAR. We do expect that additional commodities will end up being targeted in addition to those. And if you want a sort of a clue as to what else is likely to fall within scope, I would say focus on what the NGOs and the activists have been writing and publishing about in terms of other types of products that have been produced in Xinjiang. And there's plenty of that content out there. But when Customs sets its sights on a particular product, a particular commodity, and really turns on the full force of enforcement, it's clear that they are not hesitating to target significant numbers, just in terms of the raw quantity of shipments for targeting, but also at a substantial value. Customs has targeted close to $500 billion worth of shipments. I'm sorry, $500 million worth of shipments, and is since the enforcement kicked off in June, and is probably on target to hit about $2 to $3 billion worth of shipments for enforcement over the course of the first year of Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And that's just primarily focused on polysilicon, cotton, and tomatoes. So as additional commodities get added, we think that will increase significantly, even beyond the current very high rate.
Thank you. So in terms of being a legal expert, what role do you see for technology in helping entities kind of comply with this act? Like
Sure. Yeah. Well, look, technology is really potentially a very powerful tool in demonstrating that the origin of every component that exists in an imported product. Because when customs identifies a shipment and targets it for enforcement, the question becomes no longer just, do you know who the manufacturer was, the finished manufacturer, but you need to know every component that goes into that finished good, and you need to know where every component was manufactured. And if those components are themselves made from assembled subcomponents, you need to know where all of those subcomponents were manufactured. And this goes all the way back to raw material, sort of to fiber level. If you are not able to demonstrate and to prove the identity of any individual company that is in the supply chain involved in any way, directly or indirectly, in producing the detained merchandise, you will not likely be able to obtain release of the shipment that's been targeted. So really, there's no question that you have to capture that information in the most sophisticated manner possible. So obviously, using a platform that is able to capture and then host and maintain the integrity of all such data is really important.
Thank you. The next question is for Ram. Thank you, John. Ram, the supply chain network is a complex network of entities. It's very challenging for somebody to really be able to assess the kinds of those relationships, and sometimes hard to even track those relationships. How do you assess these relationships between entities in the network?
Of all the things that we've talked about, there are two things. One of them is this, I will talk about the other one later maybe. This complex network of entities is really a very, very serious issue in this particular act, in almost anything that you deal with when it comes to forced labor. The definition of what these entities are is so extensive that some of them will make you laugh. For instance, it not only defines that entities cannot be members of the same family, all the way to whether it is whole blood or half blood, whether it is descendants of those people to start with. You should not be officer and director of an organization and that organization. And if you are director and officer of two organizations, that makes it more complex in terms of that kind of shows that you're related, and proving or rebuttal that you're not is going to be that much harder. It covers partners, employees and employee. Even if you own more than 5% voting rights of any particular entity, you are a related entity. 2 or more persons directly or indirectly controlling anything is again a related entity. So this evaluation of related entity is very intense. And one of the ways to look at this is look for data providers that can actually, or that almost part of their job is to track these kind of relationships among entities globally.
Thank you. And that is a very important point. And from a product perspective too, Copperwire integrates with multiple data providers. that have this kind of information, intelligence information, which helps us to help our customers detect any kind of risky relationships deep within the hierarchy. So the second question for you, and I'm just looking at the time, I think we do have a few minutes for the next question. In the beginning of in your segment, you mentioned about the threats to the enforcement of this act, right? Talking about commingling, transshipment, and things like that. It's not just a threat for the enforcement, but also for the importer, because this is being done to befuddle and to cheat everyone, right? So how do you try and address that, because it's a complex problem?
You sure did reserve the two complex questions for me, Rakesh. This is another one of those because it's commingled. And these are literally the most significant threats to avoiding forced labor. What is being done in terms of fraud is either the products are commingled, whether it's cotton or polysilicon or anything of that kind, and or they are transshipped to a neighboring country to hide the origin of the country itself. So, as you might have already heard, one of the cautions, even within the Act, is if you are importing from any factory that has components coming from Zoar and elsewhere, you're already at a risk of detention. Proving that is a lot harder. And in all those situations, you can probably take an example from the USMCA, that is the US, Mexico, Canada, America, a treaty that we had. There they've actually proved, or rather provided, an option where you can look at how are these things accounted for. So they're looking for almost an accounting rigor to show which has come from where and whether or not it has any origin from somewhere. And once you are mixed, then they will either make both of them fail, or you will have to in a very great detailed manner prove that these have not been mixed, and therefore only portions that did not come from Zoar can be used. And another one option, which is technically advanced and it's available in some situations, is your DNA testing of those particular lots. And you can probably tell the difference which comes from Zoar and which does not.
And that has to be done prior to shipping from the source port, obviously, just when it's packed. So that, all right. So thank you. I think we are right on dot here. We have a little over 10 minutes left for the Q&A session. I just want to make sure that we cover those. Just looking at the first question here from Stephen Dowd. I saw the documentation of employees and pay stubs. Is it mandatory to get the pay stubs and passports of each employee of each supplier? Ram, you want to take that? We can't hear you, Ram. You're on mute.
The Act says that is required. If you have the Act also always provides, if you have an alternative means of supporting and providing the same information, that is allowed. I don't know of any legal nuance, which maybe John can add to it.
Yeah, sure. So the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act itself, the law does not specifically require that, but it is mentioned in the CBP importer guidance and UFLPA strategy, which were two documents that were published by the US government to help support the implementation of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. There are two questions that an importer faces when they get a detention. The first question is, can I show that there is no content in this shipment that originated in Xinjiang or was produced by an entity that comes to be listed under the Act for enforcement purposes? If you can show that there is no nexus to Xinjiang or to a listed entity, you can demonstrate that your shipment is outside the scope of the order of the enforcement of the UFLPA, and you should be able to obtain release. In that scenario, it's not necessary to produce any of the other documentation that is specified in the CBP importer guidance or UFLPA strategy. If you are not able to demonstrate that because, for example, some component within your imported merchandise did originate in Xinjiang or was produced by a listed entity, then you would need to go about the process of showing by clear and convincing evidence that there was no forced labor used in the production of your merchandise, even though it came from a listed entity or from Xinjiang. In that scenario, you would be well advised to have information and evidence such as of this nature. However, I would simply suggest that there is virtually no way that any company can rebut the presumption imposed by the UFLPA, which means that really every importer facing a detention really can only hope to navigate that detention under the first option, which is by demonstrating that there is no content from Xinjiang or from a listed entity. It is not necessary to have pay stubs and passports for every employee of every supplier in order to make that type of a showing.
Yeah, thank you for the clarification, John.
Sure.
I'm also reminded of recent activism amongst Nike shareholders, saying that some of the products being sourced from China, not from the Zhuar region, but other parts of China, involved Zhuar personnel in their labor force. So there you have the added burden of proving that those people, though they are from Zhuar, if they are employed in your workforce elsewhere outside of Zhuar, but in China, that they are working on their own free will. And there they have to prove that the contract is again voluntary, right? Not they're not being forced. So that kind of, yeah, it's a very deep topic, but again, it all boils down to getting the data to prove any level of suspicion or presumption that they have. And there are ways to get the data if required, but some of these may sound rather draconic, right? So again, we have the ability to get the data if required, and some companies are able to provide that. I'll move on to the next question. Can you give us an estimate of how many importers or companies are impacted by this regulation? John, you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned, the priority enforcement is on polysilicon, cotton, and tomatoes. We know that at this stage, Customs has targeted in excess of 1,500 shipments, and the value is probably somewhere north of $500 million at this point. We know that Customs intends to enforce this against finished merchandise coming to the United States from China and also from third countries. Predominantly, I've heard about enforcement for goods coming from Southeast Asia, but in theory, goods from any jurisdiction are potentially in scope.
Thank you. The next question, will a check that we do not do business with any of the listed Chinese entities be sufficient to assure compliance to the regulation? And it's probably the same question, but if you can, John, take this.
Yeah, sure. So any of the listed Chinese entities that's referenced in the question, keep in mind, again, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act required the US government to begin compiling a list of Chinese entities that are utilizing forced labor, or in particular elsewhere in China outside of Xinjiang, which remember is just this province in far northwest China. But any Chinese company outside of Xinjiang that has participated in one of the social programs of concern, for example, has taken a transfer of Uyghur workers out of Xinjiang for poverty alleviation purposes or other types of labor programs, may have undertaken an action that it could result in that company being listed. There are definitely hundreds, probably thousands of Chinese companies that have taken actions that could result in those companies being listed by the US government on what's called the UFLPA entity list. It is definitely important to take the UFLPA entity list and to use it as a screening mechanism. Make sure that you're not doing direct business with any entity that comes to be listed. But it actually goes a step further. because the way the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is written, it takes aim at the entirety of the supply chain. So not only can you not do business with any listed entity under the UFLPA, but no entity that is listed under the UFLPA may appear in your supply chain at any point, which means that you're functionally required to push the obligation of compliance further upstream and be able to demonstrate that no listed entity has participated in the supply chain at any point. So I would say it's not sufficient to do a check against the list, but it is certainly necessary.
Yeah, could I add one more point to that? And that is the entity list itself, you will have to ensure that there is nobody's stepbrother or stepsister involved in that same organization either. I mean, you may be actually thinking you're dealing with somebody, and so-and-so's stepbrother or a stepsister could be involved in the entity list. And that itself could be quite a complication. Right, John?
I'm honestly not certain to the full extent to which customs definitions of related parties, how exactly they intend to bring that into play. I would say that it definitely matters, though, that you know the entity or the identity of every company that is involved in the supply chain. Again, that is the whole ballgame, right? If you face a detention, you have to be able to demonstrate that you know the identity of every company that was involved in manufacture of every individual component. Sort of forget about all the rest of the data, right? The rest of the data, it's great to have it, it's great to collect it, it's great to assemble it and keep it organized. You never know what customs might show some interest in. But from a legal standpoint, what really matters is that you know the identity of every company involved in production, wholly or in part. You can demonstrate that none of them are in Xinjiang and none of them are the listed entities. If you are able to demonstrate both of those, then any detention under the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is inappropriate, because the UFLPA only applies to goods produced wholly or in part in Xinjiang or by a listed entity. So if you aren't that, you're out of scope. And that has to be the strategy for approaching enforcement that every importer that's concerned about enforcement should be taking.
Yep. Thank you. And I think this brings about greater awareness of the potential hidden relationships. At least having that in your awareness is important. But the consequence of all this is whether you approach it with supply chain traceability as a primary objective and the compliance as a consequence, or the other way around. In the end, you gain greater visibility of your supply chain. So it will have operational, financial, and legal compliance implications. Nobody would deny that being able to have full visibility across multiple tiers of a supply chain is of no value, right? So that's certainly unambiguous there. Thank you. In regards to cotton goods, does the CBP put greater emphasis on goods with a higher percentage of cotton, 100% cotton versus 30% cotton? Does this level of scrutiny, is a very interesting question. So is there any this thing, or you say, hey, if you have even 5% cotton, hey, you are under scrutiny, right? Is it that way, or does that make any difference? I'll leave it open to you, John.
Yeah, sure. So customs has always interpreted Section 307, which is the forced labor import ban that the UFLPA is built on top of. It has interpreted that law and the UFLPA as having no de minimis exception, which is to say, if you have any problematic content in your merchandise, no matter how small, customs will consider it a violation. It doesn't consider that there's any small, trivial amount of problematic fiber that it doesn't consider relevant for purposes of enforcement. That said, I do think that there is probably an inclination on the part of the agency to focus its enforcement efforts first on goods that are 100% cotton or predominant cotton. And certainly if goods are classified in a provision that identifies cotton, I would say there is potentially a higher indication of risk that the shipment could be subject to enforcement action.
That's a great answer. Thank you, John. We have passed the time, but I'll take one more question here. Does Copperwire have any strategies to promote participation, submission of documentation from suppliers? Okay, this is a common problem, right? Whether it is supply chain operational data or compliance data or sustainability data, right? You have a certain level of reliance on the supplier to voluntarily submit this data. And what we are seeing is that there are many new models emerging, including incentivization in different ways. We are happy to talk about this. I think we will share our email ID with each one of you. And we can respond to this specifically. So very interesting incentivization and even sustainability financing models that are emerging that ensures or promotes greater collaboration amongst participants in the supply chain. So with that, I think we should come to the end of this webinar. I want to thank every one of you for joining this, and as a token of our gratitude, we will be sending each one of you a detailed UFLPA problem-solving guide that will lay out all the details, step-by-step, approach to preparing and addressing any of these risk of presumption at the port, and help you avoid the risk of disruption. With that, I would like to also mention that we will have the recording of this webinar available to all of you. We'll be reaching out to each one of you. And once again, thanks a lot for joining us, and wish you a great rest of the day. Thanks to the panelists as well. Thanks, John. Thanks, George. Thanks, Ram.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.